The day's strategy failed. It wasn't the kind of failure that arrives with alarms or headlines. Strategy didn't collapse. It quietly stopped working. Plans that once felt airtight began producing the opposite of their intended effect. And the White House realized something was wrong only after momentum had already shifted. Strategy is built on assumptions. That actors behave rationally. That incentives align. That pressure produces predictable outcomes. For months, those assumptions had held. Decisions were layered carefully. Responses calibrated with precision. On paper, everything still made sense. In reality, it no longer did. The first sign appeared as a contradiction. A move designed to deter escalation instead invited testing. A signal meant to reassure allies created hesitation. Nothing dramatic, nothing undeniable, just enough deviation to unsettle those watching closely. The administration initially treated it as noise, an anomaly that would correct itself. But anomalies began to stack. Patterns emerged where none were expected. The same strategy, applied consistently, started generating diminishing returns. Worse, it produced reactions no one had modeled. The White House wasn't losing control. It was losing predictability. And in global leadership, unpredictability is often more dangerous than weakness. Briefings grew more cautious. Language shifted from confidence to concern. Advisors noticed that external actors were no longer responding to pressure as anticipated. The rules the strategy relied on were being ignored, reinterpreted, or outright rejected. The system had changed, and the strategy hadn't. The president sensed a shift before it was fully articulated. This wasn't a tactical setback. It was structural. Strategy had failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the environment it depended on no longer existed. What once stabilized now destabilized. As the realization spread, the room grew quieter. Strategy is comforting because it promises control. Its failure strips leadership down to judgment alone. There would be no adjustment that fixed this cleanly, no revision that restored certainty. Something deeper had broken. The day's strategy failed was not marked by a single decision, but by a recognition. The recognition that continuing on the same path would make the situation worse, not better. And that acknowledgement carried its own kind of risk. Because abandoning strategy means stepping into uncertainty without a map. And that is the moment when leadership becomes most exposed. The White House now faced a choice it hoped to avoid, whether to cling to a failing plan or accept that the rules had changed. Once the failure was acknowledged, the debate shifted sharply. The question was no longer how to refine the strategy, but whether to abandon it entirely. That distinction unsettled the room. Strategies are investments of credibility. Walking away from one signals adaptability to some and weakness to others. Advisors dissected the evidence carefully. This was not about impatience or overreaction. The data showed a consistent trend. Each attempt to reinforce the strategy amplified unintended consequences. Pressure created resistance instead of compliance. Reassurance bred hesitation instead of trust. The logic that once governed behavior had inverted. Some argue for doubling down. They warned that abandoning strategy midstream could embolden adversaries and unsettle allies. If the White House appeared unsure, the vacuum would be filled quickly and aggressively. Others countered that persistence had become the greater risk. Continuing a failing approach would signal blindness, not resolve. The president listened as the implications expanded. This was no longer a single policy failure. It was a test of institutional humility. Admitting that strategy had failed meant accepting that planning has limits, especially in systems shaped by perception rather than force. It meant acknowledging that control is often temporary, and influence must adapt or erode. What made the moment especially volatile was timing. The failure had been detected early enough to change course, but late enough that reversal would be costly. The administration stood between two dangers, one of escalation through persistence, the other of instability through change. As the discussion deepened, another realization surfaced. The longer the White House waited, the more others would define the failure on their behalf. Silence would not protect credibility. It would surrender the narrative to interpretation. Action, even imperfect, offered a chance to reframe intent. The room fell quiet as the president considered the trade-off. Leadership in this moment did not mean choosing a better strategy. It meant choosing whether strategy itself could still be trusted as a guide. This was the edge where planning ends and judgment begins, where expertise informs but cannot decide, and where the cost of clinging to certainty becomes higher than the cost of letting it go. The failure was now undeniable. What mattered next was how the White House would respond to it. The conflict intensified as the administration confronted what replacing a failed strategy would actually require. Abandoning it did not mean clarity would appear. It meant operating without a framework that had guided months of decisions. The White House would be exposed to criticism not just for what came next, but for admitting that what came before no longer worked. Advisors now argued from opposite fears. One feared escalation through confusion. The other feared erosion through inertia. Both understood the same truth. Strategy had provided coherence, even as it failed. Removing it would create a vacuum where every move would be judged in isolation, stripped of context and intent. The president pressed for specifics. What happens the day after we pivot? The answers were uneasy. Markets would test a shift. Allies would seek reassurance. Adversaries would probe for weakness. Every action would be read as precedent. Without strategy, there would be no narrative to absorb shocks. Only decisions, one after another, each carrying outsized meaning. As the room weighed these consequences, a deeper realization surfaced. The failure of strategy had already changed perception. External actors were adjusting in real time. Some had begun to act as if the old rules no longer applied. Others waited to see if the United States would acknowledge the change or pretend it hadn't happened. The moment of ambiguity was already shaping behavior. That realization sharpened the conflict. Maintaining the strategy would not preserve stability. It would create a mismatch between intent and effect. Yet abandoning it would require explaining restraint without weakness, flexibility without surrender. The administration would have to lead without the cover of a plan. The president recognized the inflection point. Strategy had once reduced risk by limiting improvisation. Now it increased risk by locking the White House into predictable responses. The environment rewarded adaptability, not consistency. And consistency, once a strength, had become a vulnerability. Silence followed, thick and deliberate. The conflict had reached its peak not through disagreement, but through convergence. Everyone understood that the strategy could not survive another cycle unchanged. The question was no longer whether to move away from it, but how to do so without triggering instability. Leadership in this moment would not be judged by elegance, but by timing. Too fast, and the shift would appear panicked. Too slow, and the failure would define the administration on its own terms. The margin for error was narrow and closing. The president prepared to act, knowing that the next step would not restore certainty. It would redefine it. The president chose to step away from a failing strategy without announcing its collapse. There was no public admission, no dramatic reversal. Instead, the approach was allowed to dissolve quietly, replaced by flexibility rather than doctrine. The shift was subtle but intentional. Inside the White House, this marked the true climax. The safety of a coherent plan was gone. In its place was judgment, exercised moment by moment. Decisions were no longer justified by alignment with strategy, but by their immediate effect on stability. It was leadership without a script. The consequences were immediate. Some allies expressed unease, sensing the change even without formal acknowledgement. Others welcomed the adaptability, relieved that rigid assumptions no longer dictated response. Adversaries tested boundaries, but found fewer predictable reactions to exploit. The environment became less stable, but also less exploitable. Over time, the absence of a fixed strategy created space. Space to de-escalate without retreat. Space to respond without overcommitment. Space to regain influence through interpretation rather than force. What had seemed like weakness revealed itself as resilience. The public never saw the moment strategy ended. There was no single headline to mark it. Instead, the situation simply stopped deteriorating. Progress came not through control, but through adjustment. The crisis did not vanish, but it no longer accelerated. Looking back, this moment would confuse commentators. Some would argue the administration lost direction. Others would see a deliberate evolution. Both would miss the core truth. Strategy failed because the world changed faster than plans could adapt. Leadership succeeded because it changed faster than instability. The day strategy failed was not the day control was lost. It was the day control was redefined. And sometimes the strongest leadership move is not to fix what's broken, but to let go before it breaks everything else. So what do you think? When plans fail, is leadership proven by sticking to them, or by knowing exactly when to walk away? The day